guys, today I want to talk a little bit about the bombshell that happened at the end of the Head of the Snakes storyline. Big spoilers for those of you who may have missed it. If you want to play it yourselves, now would be the time to tune out. But it was revealed at the end of the final instance that Lazarus, the Mursaat that's been hanging around with us since Season 3 began with the patch Out of the Shadows, who we thought was a Mursaat reborn, may actually not be a Mursaat at all. That in fact, this person is just an impostor. And this really opens the story up. So, let's jump in. I want to explain how we got to the place where the story is, just as a bit of a preliminary before we go into a variety of different theories about who that character might actually genuinely be, and what Arena are even angling for here, because this is a bit of a big mind blow. So, the story with Lazarus is that he was one of the last Mursaat alive, that he survived the Titan invasion, which decimated most of his people, by splitting himself into various aspects that were hidden among humans, members of the White Mantle. After the Titan threat had passed, Lazarus went to these different White Mantle, killed them, reclaiming each part of himself, and finally, when it came to the last member of the White Mantle, he could have grabbed that last part of himself and he would have been fine. But that last character, a man named Justicar Navid, saw that his brothers were dying and sought the assistance of the Asura, who corrupted Lazarus's ritual and attempt to rebuild himself. So when Lazarus did this, it did still unfortunately claim Navid's life, but somehow Lazarus was wounded by this. Stumbling away at the end of Guild Wars 1, he re-split himself, this time not into people, but into artifacts. This is full-on Harry Potter Horcrux mode here. Fragments of Lazarus's, dare I say it, soul, energy, whatever, was hidden among various artifacts, littered throughout the Maguma jungle, and there they lie in waiting. About 250 years later, the White Mantle discover the existence of these artifacts, and Confessor Ethel, who was leading the White Mantle around the time of the personal story a couple of years ago when Guild Wars 2 first came out in 2012, Confessor sends one of her most highly regarded troops, Inquisitor Zira, around the Maguma jungle to collect these artifacts and bring them all together, knowing that that would revive Lazarus and the White Mantle would get their god back. But there was a problem. Caudicus and several other members of the White Mantle didn't really care about the Mursaat anymore. It had been, 200 years, even more than that, since they'd even seen one, and they cared more about just getting in control of Kryta again. And so they sabotaged Confessor Ethel's plots. They found one of the artifacts before Zira could, and swapped it for a fake. The real artifact? We don't know where that went any longer. Caudicus explained that he didn't want it anywhere near where he lives. The foul Mursaat essence worried him, and he'd be right to be worried by it. And we don't really know where it went. There have been some theories, some suggestion that maybe, if you guys remember in Season 2 of The Living World, we heard about a Krytan artifact that was supposed to be able to detect the true heir to the throne. And there's kind of a suggestion that ironically this could be actually a fragment of Lazarus here. But wherever the real fragment is, it wasn't reclaimed by Zira. Zira picked up just a random something or other that had been swapped with Caudicus, went to do the ritual anyway, even without all of the pieces, and the expectation was that Lazarus could never be reborn because he wouldn't be complete. It's a little bit like what we saw Ritlock doing in Season 2 of The Living World. Remember, he tried to perform the ritual to get rid of the ghosts in Ascalon, but instead of succeeding, it backfired on him. He fell into the mists. It was a bit of a disaster. Well, the White Mantle were expecting something very similar to happen with Confessor Zira, but that didn't happen. Instead, we saw Lazarus was reborn. And the question is why? And if that's not really Lazarus, who is it? The way our characters talk about this at the end of the Heads of the Snake seriously does suggest that ArenaNet might be going for a story here where that's not Lazarus at all. It's just someone pretending to be Lazarus, taking advantage of that opportunity. The ritual did fail, but someone else stepped in at the right time just because they wanted to be in a position of power. So we've got a lot to talk about, the motives and what could be going on. Now, before we get into this imposter line, which I think is perhaps what the devs are more going for and what most of the community is talking about, I want to give you my original interpretation, which may be a a lot less interesting. My original interpretation when I finished The Head of the Snake wasn't that there was a new character that was being introduced here that's acting as Lazarus. I just thought that it had worked and we were simply looking at a Lazarus who was only 4/5 of himself. So what do I mean by this? Well, I mean there's no imposter. Let's look back at the Guild Wars 1 story, right? In Guild Wars 1, originally, Lazarus splits himself into humans, and then once the Titan threat has passed, as I explained, he goes to reclaim those parts for himself. So that means that just before he killed Justicar Navid, or even the guy before Justicar Navid, that we never actually saw on screen, so to speak, when he's doing that, he's not the full, complete Lazarus. He's not a full Mursaat, but he is nonetheless capable of moving around Tyria and acting his will upon the things around him, right? He still exists. It's just that he's not complete. And so I figured when I played the Head of the Snake, honestly, that nothing special was going on here, really. And I think this is still on the table, right? Maybe Zera really did only have 4 of the 5 parts of Lazarus. She did the ritual, and what we see in Rising Flames and this character that we've met through Season 3, it's still Lazarus. It's not an imposter. It's not, no one new has come onto the scene. No one's faking it. It's just, it's Lazarus, but 4/5 Lazarus, and that's it. There's no special story beyond that. And it may even go even further than this. See, there were some theories even before this patch came out, which I think may even be more true now, about Justicar Navid's role in all of this. So, the whole thing with Navid and his soul and the Asura helping him to tarnish the ritual and so forth, that was all a very Guild Wars 1-y story. It was all a very specific Guild Wars 1-y story, kind of a niche story as well, and quite a lot that you have to explain. A bit of a mouthful, really, and something that maybe I didn't think was ever going to be that relevant to Guild Wars 2's story. However, in the Head of the Snake, they actually talked about Navid a lot, and I think that even Guild Wars 2 pure players, people who never did the original Guild Wars 1 stuff, people who don't watch my videos or any other lore videos and information that's out there on the internet, all you have to do now is to play the Head of the Snake, and you will know who Navid was, and that backstory is now there, presented to Guild Wars 2 players, at least the ones who go out to find those little journals. So I'm wondering whether perhaps he could be more important than we were first led to believe, because they've given us that information to the pure Guild Wars 2 people. And as I say, this was actually a theory even before the Head of the Snake came out. The idea is this, that corruption of the ritual was that when Lazarus, all those years ago, came to Navid to reclaim a part of himself, instead of getting a part of himself, instead of getting a part of Mursaat's stuff, instead, he took a part of Navid, something human, Navid's soul or whatever. And so what that would mean is when we look at Lazarus in Guild Wars 2, we're looking at something that is 4/5 Mursaat, but then also 1/5 human, potentially. I mean, these fractions, I'm not even sure whether they totally work out. And that theory actually works really well with the dialogue we saw when we last spoke to Lazarus, when Marjorie went away with him. Let's go back over it. Remember, this is in the egg chamber. This is when Lazarus appears to us. What does Lazarus say about himself to us there? Listen, he says, "The Mursaat I was in the Tales of the Forgotten is dead." And he says, "I've been reborn, and rising from the void brings with it a new perspective." Well, what if perhaps this new perspective he has been brought to him because of his new, part human makeup? So this theory totally works with what we got in the Head of the Snake, and that was my first interpretation when I played it. I thought, okay, well, maybe it's not a totally new character, maybe it's just, it's like some weird mix of human and Mursaat, and that's about it. So that was my original theory. No, not all the artifacts and pieces of Lazarus were found, but it's okay because whatever deficit there was filled by Navid, and it's just that Corticus, when he enacted this plan to sabotage Zera, didn't realize that component was going to play a factor. That's it. If we were to go with this theory, though, there's not really much intrigue. It's kind of like the story has answered itself. It also is a story, though, that relies quite heavily on that side quest back in GW1, and even with the journals, I'm not entirely convinced that ArenaNet have done enough to explain all of this to Guild Wars 2 pure players, so maybe it's not the real answer, and especially with the way that our player character acts about this information, and Kanak acts about this information at the end of the instance, makes me think maybe things are not actually that simple, and that what a lot of the community is doing, which is speculating about a new character that's just literally being an imposter of Lazarus, that this may actually be the way to go. So let's jump into some of that speculation, shall we? Now, if we're going to go with this alternate stance, that it would have been impossible to bring Lazarus back. He's dead. He's gone. This thing is just a totally different character masquerading as Lazarus. The first thing we have to kind of identify is what would the motivation be of that character? Well, so again, the last we spoke to Lazarus, and I'm saying that with air quotes now, he did give us an apparent motive. He says that his motive is the salvation of this world, that he wants to unify against the Elder Dragons, that he thinks that what the prior Mursaat did was shameful and that they shouldn't have ran, and that he's basically trying to make amends now. And he's come to us because we've killed 2 Elder Dragons before, so who better would help him to take out the last 4? His claim is the salvation of this world. But if that's a lie, if someone is just pretending to be Lazarus for another motive, what could that be? Well, that's really hard to answer. Why a Mursaat, right? Nobody likes the Mursaat. Very few people like the Mursaat. Masquerading as a Mursaat only gives you control over what? A faction of the White Mantle themselves, who don't really even have that, or at the time especially, didn't have that much prominence within the world. None of the other active races, or even the old ancient races, even like the Mursaat anymore. So unless there's a ton of them waiting in the mists, or there's some big mind-blowing secret in Jannah, I really can't understand why, if your goal was to wrestle control of Tyria, you know, because you're some nefarious, horrible guy that just wants as much power as possible, I don't know why it would be a Mursaat you'd pretend to be. Perhaps, yeah, the White Mantle, you could argue, are a good starting point and nothing more. They are one of the only factions out there actively looking for a god that's not as primitive as the Grawl, and so it's easy for you to swoop in. But it doesn't seem like a very strong position to come into, does it, really? I suppose it depends how convincing he is over the coming months as to whether he's really a good guy or not. Okay, and so if the motive isn't nefarious, what if he genuinely does want the salvation of this world? Again, I have to wonder, why wouldn't you be honest about who you really are? Is it that the answer is this is a character we once upon a time hated, but now is seeking to turn over a new leaf and want to hide the fact that they were once hated? But what characters fall into that criteria? And that's the next thing that I want to talk about. And that's that this is actually a really wild thing we have seen this character do. If this is just an imposter, we have to accept that this is an imposter so powerful that they can, 1, hide their true being of themselves from us, which we've seen hints of in the story through Mesmer means for a while now. We had like that cryptic message from her niece back in season 2, where Kanak postulates as to her true age, and she tells him to shut up and that she's actually, you know, basically a lot older than she looks. We know that there's a lot of deception. This a powerful enough Mesmer could produce an illusion like this and make themselves look totally different. But we also have to accept, okay, that this is a character powerful enough to wipe out huge numbers of characters, as we saw him do at the end of Out of the Shadows with his crazy fiery blast. And on top of the list, the most profound thing that this character did is they absorbed a bloodstone explosion. Remember, we were told that had this bloodstone actually just exploded because of the tinkering of the White Mantle and Lazarus hadn't been around, we were told that this explosion would be so huge, it would have rippled its way into the heartland of Kryta from the Maguma jungle. That's a huge-ass nuke. That's a big explosion of magic that Lazarus, or this imposter, whether they're an imposter or whether they're Lazarus themselves, actually managed to contain. So I suppose there's a chance that this massive magical explosion was also a deception and actually wouldn't have done very much. But based on what we see in Bloodstone Fen, and based on the way that the cutscene was structured, where we witness the implosion take place from Almora's airship, I'm on the side that I actually think that it is true. That would have wiped out Kryta, and that this character, this imposter, is really quite ridiculously powerful. And power like that just doesn't come that easily in Guild Wars 2, or it hasn't in this franchise in the past. I think these are really cool signs, by the way, that the franchise is going to a place I really want it to, and that's that we move kind of away from the Elder Dragons, we move into a place where there's tons of power up for grabs, and our villains and our factions and things are revolving around who gathers up too much of that power. And, you know, this could be one of our first characters that's actually started to do such a thing, is starting to get these really godlike abilities. So we're looking for an incredibly powerful character of questionable, almost uninterpretable motives that potentially we knew in the past that would also have to hide themselves for some reason. There's not many people that fit that bill. Let's go through the list. First, let's talk about Queen Jennah. So, Jennah, Mesmer, makes sense that she could hide herself. We've never actually seen Jennah and Lazarus at the same place at the same time. That's not to say that maybe we could still see both at the same place at the same time if this fake Lazarus was more of an impostor than anything else. Jennah is, you know, lets on less than she actually knows. Jennah is actually in a position where perhaps she knew a lot of what the White Mantle were doing to be ready to pretend to be Lazarus the second that the White Mantle executed their ritual. This would be an interesting thing in that Jennah's motive could be to undermine and splinter the White Mantle from within by pretending to be Lazarus. I mean, it's a pretty crazy leap that she could be doing all that stuff in Divinity's Reach and be ever present for her civilians and the citizens of Kryta, but also nip to the Maguma jungle for a little while just to pretend to be Lazarus. But that would be a big advantage for her, right? To basically break the White Mantle in two, take away loads of Cordicus's support, and Cordicus is the bigger threat to her, I guess, and then, you know, lead the remaining White Mantle into the good fight, if you will. So it kind of works. There's another thing on Jennah's side too, and she is a very powerful character. So the other interesting thing that the head of the snake did, and I think it's very important to notice that it's the same patch that this happened, that this thing with Jennah occurred. The head of the snake showed us for the first time in-game just how powerful Jennah is. It showed us something only book readers really were familiar with. She conjured this ridiculous glamour that defended the entire city. She snapped her fingers to slaughter members of the White Mantle. She showed power, and they did that, you know, that little story of the Crichton spiderwort flower, and, you know, the idea is that that's the queen. She hides her true potential from us. Is her true potential something capable of absorbing a bloodstone explosion? Well, from what we saw in this patch, maybe. Maybe. And again, we haven't seen the two of them together. So I think Jennah is a weird one, but one that totally could be on the list. And as well, I'll point out that Anise is kind of bubbling around on the side there too. Maybe they're still linked. Perhaps this is still linked into the Livia stories. I don't think this is the time or place to go into those again. But, you know, these are the connections that maybe could end up coming to us down the line. So Jennah's one idea. Moving on, staying with Crichton characters. I have heard some people say Casimir. And so I do want to dive a little bit into Casimir here, because it's not just her, but it's where she comes from too. Casimir has been mysteriously missing this entire season. And so it's a lot more believable, perhaps, for Casimir to have been hiding and masquerading as Lazarus than even Jennah, because, you know, oh, Casimir exits and all of a sudden Lazarus is hanging around. She's also a Mesmer. What I find interesting too is that Casimir is a member of this Mesmer initiative that we heard about way back in the Tower of Nightmares, and could just be a little bit of random flavor and world building, or could be something more important, and maybe this is some kind of plot or scheme from them. We knew that Casimir isn't the most powerful character in the world, but her strength was growing in terms of identifying deception. But I've got to say, I don't put too much stock in this theory. What's the motive? And this would have been led into so weirdly and so badly, and the way that our characters have been talking about Casimir throughout the season, if you really sit down and go back through season 3, I just don't think it can be Casimir. I'll eat my hat if I'm wrong, but it's something that people have been throwing out. There is another kind of interesting thing that I've seen, and I did mull over a little bit myself, and that's the Asura. I'm talking the Arcane Eye, sorry. I'm talking the Inquest, perhaps. Or I'm even talking perhaps another faction of Asura, maybe even a faction of Asura associated with all this fractal stuff going on, though I'm more inclined to believe that they'll keep these two storylines separate. What you should remember, guys, is if we rewind the clock back to GW1, it was the Asura that Naveed went to, and it was the Asura that figured out this ritual that Lazarus was doing. And so, on paper, if you look at the amount of people who actually knew about the ritual, who knew what Zera was trying to do, who knew what Ethel was trying to do, who knew the potential threat of the success here, there are very few people in the know. And the Asura are one of the only group that actually may have had knowledge that passed down. So there was an Asura called Glavin. He's the guy who gave you all these quests in Guild Wars 1. What happened to Glavin after GW1? Perhaps he made a lot of writings, kept his notes, and that information passed down 250 years to some other enterprising Asura of today that saw this was going to happen, and now they're stepping up. Maybe the imposters are some Asura out there who have seen these foolish, stupid human conflicts and decided that they'd make their mark on them. It's something. There's another idea, and that's Janthea. So here we're building theories on theories, okay? But if we think about Janthea, if the Eye of Janthea, if the Isles of Janthea, if Janthea is not just a name for a location, but Janthea as a place is named after a person, as we've talked about in the past, and there is some reason to get behind. If these speculations end up true, perhaps it's not Lazarus at all, perhaps it's this extra mysterious character that might be waiting in the wings, that could have totally different motives. Another thing that would make sense here is this is kind of related to bloodstones, and he got charged by bloodstones, and this is a bloodstone explosion we were looking at. And there's a theory again that there might have been a bloodstone explosion on the Isles of Janthea, and this Janthea maybe had the motive that he wanted to absorb it, but he couldn't reveal himself or something, so he pretended to be Lazarus, or maybe he is a Mursaat, he's just pretending to be a different Mursaat. But I believe that this is well and truly tinfoil hat territory, and we're going down the rabbit hole here. It's just not easy to pin a very specific character. Moving on, I have a list of some very minor ideas that you really can't elaborate much on, but could be worth talking about. There is Isgaron. So who's Isgaron, you might wonder? Isgaron is this mysterious character that lives in the Wizard's Tower. So, and could be related to Verata of the first game, and so on. So, if you need a refresher on what happened with the Wizard's Tower, I can't recommend anything better than my own Wizard's Tower Guild Wars 2 mystery video from like 3 years ago now. There'll be a link on screen if you want to check that out. But long story short, there are a lot of themes around the Wizard's Tower with, there seems to be the idea that a cult of necromancers, or a single necromancer, or a lich, or someone, or some collective were experimenting a lot with this idea of necromancy and minionmancy and taking that to its extremes. And this means diving into soul magic, and this deals with diving into a variety of places that many people consider immoral. I am a big fan of the Wizard's Tower storyline eventually going into the idea of what was happening at the Foundry of the Failed Creations in Guild Wars 1's Realm of Torment and the construction of Titans, but the simple fact that there's this idea of souls that we're dealing with here, look at Lazarus's story. It's also got a lot to do with, you know, splitting his essence, his soul, his being apart into multiple different places, binding them to Tyria to survive for a long time. And this idea of binding things in such a way, it's very similar to this whole, you know, Golomancy idea and what Ula was looking into. Perhaps the Wizard's Tower may have some tie. Also consider the fact that the Wizard's Tower is connected to Kryta, and maybe that's another angle of opportunity there. It would be a chance for the devs to make that core story instead of what is currently more of a side story. Another minor little theory, what about E? A lot of people have speculated about this. E is just like the perfect catch-all mysterious character you can graft just about any mystery in the game and theory onto E, so of course he's relevant here. We could talk about Livia, which I already did, I guess. I have heard it said, I did a stream with Boots, where he mentioned the idea of Mad King Thorn or his kids. I believe this was actually pointed out in chat for us. Maybe one of these characters. The only line of thinking there would be, again, the Crichton connection, the fact that they're very powerful characters. There's also, I suppose, with those two specifically, the fact that a lot of people have been disappointed the Halloween story just kind of ended. So incorporating the Halloween story maybe into some of the core story is a way of progressing that a bit and making those people happy. And back in Guild Wars 1 Halloween, it was demonstrated that the Mad King was more than capable of transforming random citizens into different creatures and characters. He would just, you know, turn you into a Necrid horseman or something. And isn't that kind of similar, that appearance change, kind of similar to what we're seeing an imposter doing to look like Lazarus, maybe? Other people have speculated about Palawa Joko. Maybe this is some kind of plot to gain power beyond Ilona. And, of course, the Mesmer initiative I've got written here as well, which, of course, I have already talked about. So, those are the big ones. I will close out the video with one final idea. And it's an idea I'm not too sure about. It's an idea I've heard for a very long time, someone leaving comments in my videos about, which seemed to make no sense until this patch. But I will throw it out to you guys. Let's take it from the top, all right? This supposed imposter is a character capable of killing a load of people very easily with fiery blasts, and it's someone who's absorbed the magic of an entire bloodstone, right? How many characters do we know to have actually interacted with the Bloodstones, messed with them, understood their making? Well, the ancient races, the seers, yes, but also more recently, perhaps, the human gods. And you know what? If you were to sit down and say to me before the head of the snake, wooden potatoes, I want a character to absorb a Bloodstone explosion, what characters were in the universe would you have do that? I think the human gods are some of the only ones that have been demonstrated to be powerful enough to accomplish something like that. So, this is a bit more of an interesting theory now since the head of the snake came out. What if, guys, the devs are reintroducing the human gods to the story? What if this imposter, when they say that they look for the salvation of this world, what if they're not lying? What if the human gods have returned? They've seen not only the elder dragons have started rising again, but a couple of them have been defeated as well. And maybe they've decided, you know what, we're not going to be in hiding anymore. We're actually going to help out. This works on a lot of different levels. Now, let me remind you guys, what can the human gods not do? They cannot appear as themselves to mortals, for mortals go blind to look upon them. So what best way to get around this? Well, appear as something else. Why a human god would choose a Mursaat to come back as in Lazarus, I'm really not sure. But it's a possibility that that's an actual motive there as to why they would appear and hide themselves. Maybe they really do want to help, but they're just not ready to reveal who it is. And so if this is actually the answer here, that they could absorb the Bloodstone explosion because they understand Bloodstones because they're powerful enough for it. They really do want the salvation of this world. They have to hide themselves because we'd go blind. What god particularly could this be? Is it all of them? You know, dipping in and out? Is it just one? Well, so my first thought might be Lissa, the patron goddess of Mesmers back in the first game, Illusion. If you actually read Lissa's scriptures, there is a story about how she appears as a haggard, diseased old woman and comes to a village, and only one person has the balls to help that old woman out, and then Lissa reveals herself and says, you will be my first disciple. So it could be Lissa. This is very much in with Lissa's modus operandi. It could also be, if you think about the way that Lazarus is attacked, Lazarus was a necromancer in Guild Wars 1, but all we've seen Lazarus do in this game is use massive fiery explosive attacks. So what if Lazarus is Balthazar? And we've seen Balthazar be a fallible character in the past. We've seen Balthazar, out of all the gods, I think, be the most interesting of them. So perhaps Balthazar has returned. Or lastly, maybe this could be Jennah. And it could, and the reason I say Jennah is because Jennah was kind of the leader of the gods, and she seemed to give the biggest shit about humanity's well-being and health and comfort, and maybe it's her as the leader she's returned. So I'm not really sure. I like the idea of it just being one god. I love the idea that maybe this could be a god that's gone rogue too. You guys will recall that the gods warred among themselves once upon a time because Abaddon decided to give everyone lots of magic. Why did Abaddon do that is still a question hanging over our heads when you really get down to it. And maybe just as Abaddon defected once upon a time, perhaps we've seen Lissa or Balthazar or Jennah or someone also defect, and they've decided to try and help Tyria out while the rest of the gods are still off in hiding for some reason. Could be the most interesting of all the theories, this last one we've left here. It kind of works, but I think the devs have to do a lot more to set it up. And it could be, if they do it well though, a perfect opportunity to get into some of the deeper stories a lot of players have been asking for a long time. I'm curious about it. I'm cautious about it. The gods are a great part of the world building and the franchise here, but they're also good because they're so inscrutable. And I'd be very concerned at the devs picking this storyline back up and, you know, ruining it somehow. So we'll see. I'd love to hear what you guys think. What's your favorite theory on who Lazarus is? I think I've hit all the biggest corners here. If I've missed a big one, let me know in the comments. We've had lots of interesting things across many of these lore videos I've done. I'll probably do one big sum up video coming up in the future of your responses to the things I've said, so we'll really get, you know, the other side of the coin. So please do leave the discussions down there. I think we've got some great ones going on with many of these videos. Thanks very much for watching, guys. I'll see you tomorrow for even more lore. You're probably going to see a snippet from one of the streams I did. Don't be scared to click it, because it's got some amazing extra lore that I never told you about from the end of the raid wing. It's got nothing to do with actual raiding content, if you're not interested in that, but it's got a really, really amazing example of environmental storytelling and voice acting and story that, honestly, you do not want to miss. That will probably come tomorrow, and we'll see where we go from there. So thanks very much for watching, guys. Let me know what you think about any of the theories, and I'll be in the comments. Have a good one. Paid his debt to the Lucky Horseshoe, he was eventually fingered by one of his victims and tried as a thief. His punishment was exile from the kingdom of Kryta. The local authorities blindfolded him and rode him out 3 full weeks before leaving him to fend for himself. Alone, broken, lost, Saul wandered through a dense forest for several days, surviving on only roots and berries. On the 4th day, delirious with hunger, Saul emerged from the trees to see what he thought was a hallucination. A city of massive towers reaching into the heavens. The architecture was astounding, and the creatures who lived here were unlike any he had ever seen. Walking down into their city, Saul got a closer look at the denizens of this place. They were